They laughed when she walked into the boardroom with a mop. Then the CEO handed her a document worth $3 million. What he didn't know was that one paragraph inside that paper would destroy his career forever. But before you hear what she read, subscribe now, because stories like this don't get told twice. Watch till the very end, because the truth hidden in that document doesn't just shock the room, it changes everything. So, let's get started. The boardroom on the 42nd floor smelled like money. Polished oak tables, leather chairs that had never known sweat, floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking a city that pulsed with ambition even after midnight. This was where decisions were made, decisions that ruined lives or built empires with the stroke of a pen. And tonight, those pens were resting beside a document worth $3 million. At the far end of the room, Richard Hallstrom leaned back in his chair, one hand loosened around a crystal glass of whiskey. He was the CEO, young for the title, ruthless by reputation. Every man and woman in that room knew one thing: Richard Hallstrom never lost. "Let's be clear," Richard said, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut. "If this acquisition closes by Friday, we will crush our competitors permanently." Nods rippled around the table. No one noticed the soft squeak of rubber soles against marble. Except him. A black woman pushed a janitorial cart slowly along the wall. Her uniform was faded blue, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows. Her movements were quiet, precise, someone who had learned long ago how to exist without being seen. Her name was Elena Carter. She stopped near the corner, lowering her mop into a bucket, careful not to interrupt. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the table, not lingering, not curious, just a glance. Richard caught it. He paused mid-sentence and smirked. "Really?" he said, tilting his head toward her. "Can we not schedule cleaning after executive meetings?" The room chuckled lightly. Not too loudly, just enough to show agreement. Elena froze for half a second. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I'll be quick." Richard waved his hand dismissively. No, stay. Might as well learn how real business works." More laughter. A little louder this time. Elena nodded and returned to her work, eyes down, shoulders relaxed. She had mastered the art of appearing unaffected, but something about her calm irritated him. Richard leaned forward and tapped the thick document at the center of the table. "This," he announced, "is the most valuable paper in this room." He looked at Elena again. "Worth more than your house. Probably more than your lifetime earnings." One executive shifted uncomfortably. Another smiled. Elena said nothing. Richard grinned wider. "Hey, why don't you come here?" The room went quiet. Elena hesitated, then slowly walked forward, stopping a few feet from the table. Her hands were damp from the cleaning solution. She wiped them against her uniform without looking up. "Yes, sir?" Richard slid the document toward her. "Go on," he said. "Read it." A few people laughed nervously. Elena blinked. "Sir, I said read it," Richard repeated. "Unless it's too complicated." The air thickened. Elena looked down at the document. Dense text, legal language, clauses stacked on clauses, the kind of paper that destroyed people who misunderstood even a single line. She didn't touch it. "I don't think," she began. Richard cut her off. "Relax. It's just words. Or are they too big?" Someone snorted. Elena lifted her eyes for the first time. And something in her gaze, steady, unreadable, made the room shift. Richard didn't notice. "Tell you what," he said casually. "If you can read that document without messing it up, I'll give you $10,000. A pause. Then, with a cruel smile, he added, "Actually, make it interesting." He leaned back. $3 million. The room exploded in shocked laughter. Elena stared at the document. Slowly, she reached out. Her fingers touched the paper, and for the first time that night she smiled. The laughter didn't explode all at once. It rolled slowly across the boardroom, like a wave testing the shore. Some executives laughed openly. Others covered their mouths, eyes darting between Richard and the cleaning lady, as if gauging how far this humiliation was allowed to go. A few stayed silent, frozen, sensing something was wrong but unwilling to interrupt power. Elena Carter stood there, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the document. $3 million. Richard leaned back in his chair, enjoying the moment. Go on, he said. Don't be shy. You might be the smartest person in the room. More laughter. Elena felt it land on her skin like heat. She had been laughed at before by landlords, by recruiters, by people who looked through her instead of at her. She knew the sound, knew how it was meant to shrink her. She also knew something else. This wasn't just a document. Her eyes scanned the first page without moving her head. Titles, formatting. The structure was familiar, too familiar. Richard noticed her stillness. What's wrong? He asked. Cat got your tongue? Elena exhaled slowly. May I sit? She asked. The room went quiet again. Richard raised an eyebrow. Sit? Yes, sir. It's a long document. A few executives exchanged glances. One of them, a gray-haired woman from law, felt a strange tightening in her chest. Something about the way Elena spoke didn't fit the uniform she wore. Richard chuckled. By all means, make yourself comfortable. Elena pulled out a chair at the far end of the table. The leather creaked under her weight. She placed the document flat, smoothing it with both hands, as if greeting an old acquaintance. Richard glanced at his watch. You have 5 minutes, he said. After that, I expect you to go back to mopping. Elena nodded. She began to read. Not aloud. Her eyes moved quickly now, line by line. Clause numbers, cross-references, subsections, buried inside subsections. The language was dense, intentionally so, the kind of writing designed to confuse, to exhaust, to hide consequences behind elegance. Richard watched her for a moment, amused, then annoyed. Well, he snapped, we don't have all night. Elena lifted her head. You want me to read it aloud? She asked. Richard smirked. Please, entertain us. She cleared her throat, and then she read. Her voice was calm, measured, confidence. She didn't stumble, didn't pause, didn't mispronounce a single word. The room shifted, not metaphorically, physically. A young executive stopped smiling. The legal advisor's pen froze mid-air. Even the air conditioner seemed louder now. Elena continued, reading clauses exactly as written. No simplification, no hesitation. When she reached the end of the page, she turned it cleanly. Richard sat up straighter. That's enough, he said, forcing a laugh. Anyone can read words off a page. Elena looked at him. That wasn't the agreement, she said gently. You asked if I could read it without messing it up. Silence. Richard's jaw tightened. Fine. Keep going. She did, page after page. Then halfway through, she stopped. Her finger rested on a paragraph buried deep in the document. This clause, she said slowly, is interesting. Richard waved his hand. Everything in that document is interesting. That's why it's worth $3 million. Elena shook her head. No, she said. This clause is worth more than that. The legal advisor leaned forward. Which clause? She asked, before she could stop herself. Elena looked up. Section 14, subsection C, she said. The indemnity clause. Richard laughed sharply. That's boilerplate. Elena met his eyes. Boilerplate doesn't usually transfer personal liability, she said. The room went completely still. Richard stood up. What did you just say? Elena turned the document toward him. This clause, she repeated, makes you responsible. Not the company. You. Her voice didn't rise, but the tension did. For a moment, no one spoke. Richard Hallstrom stood frozen at the head of the table, one hand braced against the polished wood. The city lights behind him reflected in the glass wall, framing his silhouette like a man suddenly on trial. That's not funny, he said finally, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Elena remained seated. I'm not joking, she replied. The legal advisor, Margaret Lewis, reached for the document with trembling fingers. May I see that? She asked, her voice tight. Richard shot her a warning look. Margaret. She ignored him. Elena slid the document across the table without resistance. Her movements were calm, almost respectful, as if this wasn't a confrontation at all but a correction. Margaret scanned Section 14, subsection C. Her face drained of color. That clause, she whispered. It's not standard. One executive laughed nervously. Come on. We've had 3 firms review this. Margaret didn't look up. Firms review what they're paid to review, she said quietly. And they don't always look for what hurts the client. Richard slammed his palm on the table. That's enough, he barked. This meeting is over. No one moved. Elena spoke again. You should keep reading, she said. The penalty triggers automatically if the acquisition fails regulatory approval. Margaret's eyes widened. How do you know that? Elena hesitated just long enough for the room to feel it. Because it's written that way, she said. Richard pointed at her. You don't belong here. Elena stood slowly. Neither does personal liability in a corporate acquisition, she replied. A murmur rippled around the table. Richard's control was slipping, and he felt it. He turned to Margaret. Is she right? Margaret swallowed. If subsection C holds, then yes. The liability falls on you personally. $3 million. The room erupted. Is that real? Why wasn't this flagged? That could destroy him. Richard's face hardened. This is nonsense, he said. You're all letting a cleaning lady embarrass us. Elena flinched, not visibly, but internally. The words landed where old scars lived. She took a breath. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone, she said. I came here to clean. A beat. But when you asked me to read this document, she continued, you made it my responsibility to be honest. Richard laughed bitterly. Honest? You think you understand contracts better than my entire legal team? Elena met his gaze. I think I understand this one. Margaret looked up at Elena, eyes searching. Where did you learn to read like this? Elena didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out over the city, the same city that had once promised her everything. I used to sit in rooms like this, she said quietly. On the other side of the table. The room stilled. Richard scoffed. You expect us to believe that? Elena turned back. Yes, she said simply. Because I helped draft contracts just like this. Margaret's breath caught. You're saying you were a lawyer? Elena nodded once. Silence swallowed the room. Richard shook his head, laughing again, but this time it sounded hollow. No, this is a game, a setup. Elena stepped closer to the table. If you'd like, she said. I can explain the next clause too. The one that voids your indemnity if you initiated the acquisition under false financial projections. Margaret gasped. Richard felt the floor tilt beneath him. Stop, he whispered. Elena didn't. You signed this document, Richard, she said softly. Every page. She paused. And you didn't read it closely enough. The room watched him now, not as a CEO, but as a man who had just realized he might lose everything. Elena Carter didn't always clean offices at night. There was a time long before the mop, the uniform, the silence, when she wore tailored suits and heels that clicked with authority against marble floors just like this one. She remembered the first boardroom she ever entered as an attorney. She had been 27, freshly promoted, the youngest associate at a prestigious corporate law firm in Chicago. Her name had been whispered then too, but with surprise, not mockery. She's sharp, scary sharp. Don't underestimate her. Elena had learned early that brilliance was her shield. She grew up in a one-bedroom apartment with a mother who worked double shifts and a father who died too early. Books were her escape. Law became her weapon. By the time she graduated top of her class, contracts felt like second languages, every loophole, every trap, every hidden consequence. And she had been good. Too good. Her downfall began with a document not unlike the one sitting on Richard Hallstrom's table. A corporate acquisition. High stakes. Bigger egos. Elena had been assigned to review it late, too late, some said. But she noticed something others missed. A clause, designed to quietly transfer liability from the corporation to a single executive if regulators intervened. Illegal, predatory, intentional. When she flagged it, her supervisor told her to let it go. When she refused, the tone changed. You're being difficult. You don't understand how things work. Do you know who you're going up against? Elena had known, and she had spoken anyway. Within weeks, she was removed from the case. Within months, she was quietly let go. No explanation, no reference, just a polite email thanking her for her service. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Then the interviews stopped. Recruiters didn't return her calls. Firms that once praised her suddenly found better fits. Her name, she learned too late, had been marked, not a team player. The legal world closed its doors without ever saying why. Savings ran out. Pride followed. Cleaning became temporary. Temporary became permanent. And still she never stopped reading. Contracts, court rulings, law journals she borrowed from libraries. She stayed sharp in the dark while the world forgot her. Now, standing in Richard Hallstrom's boardroom, Elena felt the weight of that forgotten past pressing against her ribs. She turned from the window. I didn't lose my skills, she said quietly. I lost my access. The executives listened, stunned. Margaret spoke first. Why didn't you fight it? Sue? Elena smiled faintly. Who do you sue when no one admits what they did? Richard remained silent, but his face had gone pale. The truth is, Elena continued, people like you don't expect people like me to come back. She looked at the document again. And you count on that. Margaret cleared her throat. If what you're saying is true, this clause could destroy you, Richard. Richard finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled, dangerous. This conversation ends now, he said. Security. No one moved. Elena met his eyes. You mocked me because you thought I was invisible, she said. But invisibility teaches you things. She tapped the document. Like how to read what others overlook. Richard clenched his jaw. Outside the glass walls, the city glittered, unaware that a reckoning had begun. And Elena knew something else now. This wasn't just about $3 million. This was about who controlled the room. Richard Hallstrom hated losing control. He had built his career on certainty, on walking into rooms and watching people straighten their spines, lower their voices, and wait for his approval. Control was his currency. Without it, he was just another man in an expensive suit. And tonight, control was slipping through his fingers. Security, Richard repeated, louder this time. Still, no one moved. The guards outside the glass walls hesitated, glancing at Margaret Lewis, then at the board members. No one gave them a signal. This wasn't a hallway dispute. This was a power struggle, and they knew better than to step into it. Richard turned slowly to the board. You're really going to let this continue? He asked. She's an employee. Nothing more. Margaret folded her hands. She's more informed than we are right now. That cut deeper than laughter ever could. Richard's lips tightened. This is absurd. One clause doesn't change the deal. Elena stepped forward. It does, she said calmly. When it's the clause that determines who pays when everything goes wrong. She turned the document back toward him. Section 18, she continued. Termination and indemnity reversal. Margaret inhaled sharply. There's a reversal clause? Elena nodded, hidden behind cross-references. It activates if the executive knowingly proceeds with flawed projections. All eyes turned to Richard. That's not true, he snapped. Our projections were solid. Elena didn't argue. She simply pointed. Page 47, she said. Exhibit D. Margaret flipped pages. Faster now. Her expression darkened. This shows projected revenues adjusted after regulatory risk was identified, she said slowly. Richard, did you authorize this change? Richard didn't answer. The silence screamed. One board member leaned forward. You told us the numbers were conservative. Richard finally spoke, his voice sharp. I told you what you needed to hear. The room erupted. You misled us. That puts us all at risk. Are we exposed legally? Elena watched, silent, as the room turned against the man who had mocked her minutes earlier. Richard raised his hands. Enough. I can explain. Elena spoke again. You don't need to, she said. The document already did. Margaret closed the file slowly. If regulators review this acquisition and find these inconsistencies, the company can distance itself. And Richard can't, another board member added quietly. Richard's face was drained of color. This is an ambush, he said hoarsely, pointing at Elena. You planned this. Elena shook her head. You invited me. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Richard turned toward the exit, pacing now. Fine. What do you want? Elena considered him. For tonight? She said. Nothing. That confused him more than anger ever could. I'm not here for revenge, she continued. I'm here because the truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. She stepped back toward her cleaning cart. I still have a job to finish. The room watched as she picked up her mop again. No one laughed this time. No one spoke. Richard stared at the document in his hands, realizing the unimaginable. The power he wielded so easily could be taken just as fast. And it had started with a woman he never thought mattered. Elena was halfway down the hallway when she heard her name. Not hey, not you. Her name. Elena Carter. She stopped. The hallway outside the boardroom was dim, lit by soft, recessed lights that hummed faintly. Her cleaning cart stood beside her like a shield. For a second, she considered pretending she hadn't heard it. Names carried weight. Names pulled you back into rooms you'd fought hard to leave. She turned slowly. Margaret Lewis stood there, alone now. No executives. No Richard. Just the legal advisor, heels off, suit jacket loosened, eyes sharp with something that looked dangerously close to awe. I thought so, Margaret said quietly. I knew it the moment you pointed out Section 14. Elena said nothing. Margaret stepped closer. You clerked under Judge Harold Finch, didn't you? That name landed hard. Elena's throat tightened before she could stop it. Yes, she said. Margaret exhaled slowly. I read your work. Years ago. You dismantled a corporate immunity defense that 5 senior attorneys missed. Elena looked away. That was a long time ago. Not long enough to forget, Margaret replied. They stood there in silence, the kind that feels heavier than noise. Why are you here? Margaret asked gently. Really? Elena looked down at her hands, calloused now, faintly smelling of disinfectant. Because life doesn't ask permission before it changes, she said. Margaret nodded. Richard ruined you. Elena didn't answer. I've seen this before, Margaret continued. Brilliant lawyers who won't play dirty get pushed out. Quietly. Efficiently. Elena met her eyes. Then you know how this ends. Margaret hesitated. It doesn't have to. Behind the glass walls, voices rose again. The board was still arguing. Richard's shadow paced back and forth like a trapped animal. They're discussing removing him, Margaret said. Temporarily. Until this is reviewed. Elena raised an eyebrow. And you're telling me this because? Because, Margaret said carefully, they're going to need someone who understands that document better than anyone else in the building. Elena laughed softly. Not amused. Not hopeful. Just tired. I don't belong there anymore. Margaret stepped closer. You already do. They just didn't realize it. Elena shook her head. Recognition didn't save me last time. Margaret lowered her voice. This time, it's public. That gave Elena pause. Public truth was harder to bury. Before Elena could respond, the boardroom doors swung open. Richard stormed out. His tie was loosened now, his face flushed with anger and fear. He stopped when he saw Elena and Margaret together. Of course he understood. You, he said, pointing at Elena. This isn't over. Elena didn't flinch. It's just beginning, she replied. Richard turned to Margaret. If you think for 1 second, Margaret, cut him off. You should be more concerned with the regulators than with her. Richard's eyes burned. You think she's a hero? I think, Margaret said, you underestimated the wrong person. Richard stepped closer to Elena, lowering his voice. You want back in? Is that it? Is this some kind of audition? Elena met his gaze, steady and unafraid. No, she said. This is a reckoning. Security appeared at the end of the hall. Not for her, for him. Richard realized it too late, and as he was escorted away, Elena understood something profound. The building hadn't changed. She had. The boardroom felt different without Richard Hallstrom. Not quieter, just heavier. The chairs were the same. The table still gleamed under the lights. But something invisible had shifted, like a throne removed before anyone knew who would claim it. Elena stood near the door, her cleaning cart beside her, unsure why she had been asked to stay. Margaret Lewis took the head seat. That alone told Elena everything. "We're not here to pretend tonight didn't happen," Margaret said, looking around the table. "We're here to decide what happens next." No one argued. One board member cleared his throat. "Regulators will smell blood if this gets out." Another added, "If they review the acquisition documents, they'll find the clause." That's unavoidable now. All eyes slowly drifted to Elena. She remained still. Margaret turned to her. "Miss Carter." "Elena," she corrected herself. "We'd like to ask you some questions." Elena nodded once. "I figured, did you know about this document before tonight?" a board member asked. "No," Elena replied. "I recognized the structure, not the content." "And the clause?" another asked. "How did you spot it so fast?" Elena hesitated, then spoke honestly. "Because it was designed to be missed. That's always a red flag." The board exchanged glances. Margaret leaned forward. "If regulators investigate, they'll want someone who can explain exactly how this clause works and why it's dangerous." Elena said nothing. "We want you to consult," Margaret continued. "Temporarily." There it was, the offer. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly life-altering. Elena felt her chest tighten. "Consult? As what?" she asked. "As an independent legal advisor," Margaret said. "Paid, protected, on record." One board member added, "You'd help us untangle the exposure Richard created." Elena looked at the table. The document was still there, open, waiting like a door she'd sworn never to walk through again. "And if I say no?" she asked. Margaret didn't hesitate. "Then we respect that, but we'll be walking blind." Elena thought of the years she'd scrubbed floors beneath rooms like this. Thought of interviews that ended before they began. Thought of how easily brilliance could be erased if it made the wrong people uncomfortable. "You understand," Elena said slowly, "that stepping back in puts a target on my back." Margaret nodded. "Yes. And that this time," Elena continued, "I won't stay quiet." A murmur ran through the room. Margaret met her gaze. "That's exactly why we're asking." Elena inhaled deeply. She wasn't afraid of the work. She was afraid of hope. "I have one condition," she said. The room stilled. Margaret gestured. "Name it." "No private conversations," Elena said. "No quiet deals. Everything in writing. Everything is transparent." The board members exchanged looks. Then one by one, they nodded. Margaret extended her hand. "Welcome back." Elena didn't take it right away. She glanced down at her uniform, at the mop still leaning against the cart. "I'll finish my shift," she said. "Then we'll talk." Margaret smiled. Not condescending. Not surprised. Of course. As Elena walked out of the boardroom, she felt it again, that sensation she hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not revenge, choice. And behind the closed doors, one truth settled heavily over everyone still seated at the table. They hadn't just lost a CEO. They had just invited a reckoning. The building felt different in daylight. Sunlight poured through the glass walls, exposing every reflection, every whisper, every glance. The 42nd floor buzzed with quiet tension, the kind that comes after something explosive happens but before the news breaks. Elena Carter stepped out of the elevator and felt it immediately. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People stared just a second too long. She wasn't wearing the cleaning uniform today. She wore a simple dark suit. No designer label, no flashy jewelry. Just clean lines and confidence she'd had to relearn how to carry. Still, to them, she wasn't new. She was unexpected. A junior associate whispered, "That's her." Another murmured, "The cleaning lady?" Elena walked past them without slowing. Margaret Lewis was already waiting inside a smaller conference room. "You made it," she said. "I said I would," Elena replied. Margaret gestured toward the table. "Before we start, you should know Richard has retained counsel." Elena nodded. Of course he has. And he's contesting everything, Margaret continued. Claims the clause was misinterpreted. Claims you manipulated the situation. Elena smiled faintly. That won't hold. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You sound sure. I wrote versions of clauses like that for years, Elena said. They don't survive daylight. Margaret slid a thin folder across the table. Then you'll want to see this. Elena opened it. Her smile disappeared. These projections, she said slowly. They're altered, Margaret nodded. After board approval. Quietly. We didn't even know. Elena flipped another page. Then another. Her jaw tightened. This isn't just one bad deal, she said. It's a pattern. Margaret leaned back. That's what worries me. Before Elena could respond, the door opened. Two senior executives stepped in, men who hadn't looked at her twice when she pushed a mop past their chairs. Now they couldn't stop staring. We just want to say, one began awkwardly. What you did last night? It was impressive. Elena didn't respond. The other cleared his throat. We underestimated you. Yes, Elena said calmly. You did. The silence that followed was uncomfortable but deserved. A knock interrupted them. Margaret stood. That'll be compliance. As the executives left, Elena gathered the files. Her hands were steady, but inside, something twisted. This was the part she'd forgotten. Not the law. Politics. As she walked down the corridor toward the compliance office, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. Elena Carter, a familiar voice said softly. You always did like dramatic entrances. Her stomach dropped. Richard, she said. I hear you're back, he continued. Consulting, advising, fixing my mess. Your mess isn't mine anymore, Elena replied. He laughed quietly. You think the board protects you? She stopped walking. This world doesn't reward truth, Richard said. It buries it. Elena's voice was calm. You should worry less about me and more about what else I'll find. The line went dead. Elena stared at her phone. She knew then Richard wasn't done, and neither was she, because buried inside the altered projections was something far worse than personal liability, something that could bring down the entire company, and she was the only one who saw it. Elena stayed late. Again, the 42nd floor emptied slowly, lights clicking off row by row until only a few offices glowed against the darkening city. Cleaning crews worked other floors now. For the first time in years, Elena wasn't one of them. She sat alone in a glass-walled conference room, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back, documents spread around her like pieces of a crime scene, because that's what this was, a crime. She circled a number on the page, then another, then another. They didn't match. Projected revenues from 3 subsidiaries were inflated slightly, deliberately, just enough to pass board approval, just enough to trigger performance bonuses, just enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. But when Elena overlaid the data with older internal reports, the truth surfaced. These companies were bleeding. She leaned back slowly, heart pounding. This isn't negligence, she whispered to herself. This is fabrication. Elena traced the timeline. Revisions made after approval. Documents rerouted through shell departments. Digital signatures added late at night. Always the same authorization code, Richard's. But something else caught her attention. A secondary approval. Someone else had signed off. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she pulled the metadata, and then she froze. The second authorization belonged to someone still inside the building. Her phone buzzed on the table, making her jump. Margaret. Elena, Margaret said when she answered. Tell me you're sitting down. I am, Elena replied. And I think this is bigger than Richard. There was a pause on the line. Compliance just flagged unusual fund transfers tied to the acquisition. Elena closed her eyes. How much? 7 figures, Margaret said. Moved through a consulting firm that doesn't actually exist. Elena swallowed. They used the acquisition as cover, she said. False projections to inflate valuation. The clause to dump liability. And shell firms siphon money. Margaret exhaled shakily. That's criminal. Yes, Elena said. And not everyone involved has been exposed yet. Who else? Margaret asked. Elena hesitated. I'm still confirming, she said carefully. She ended the call and turned back to the documents. Her eyes landed on the second signature again. The name was familiar, too familiar. Someone who had sat in that boardroom. Someone who had nodded along while Richard mocked her. Someone who had shaken her hand this morning. Elena's stomach twisted. A soft sound echoed behind her. Footsteps. She turned. A man stood just outside the glass wall, badge still clipped to his belt. Mid-level executive. Friendly smile. One of the first to congratulate her earlier. You're working late, he said through the glass. Elena didn't move. So are you. He stepped inside, letting the door slide shut behind him. I heard compliance was asking questions, he said lightly. Thought I'd see if you needed help. Elena studied his face. The relaxed posture, the casual tone, the practiced innocence. I'm fine, she said. Actually, I was just about to leave. He smiled wider. Good, because digging too deep tends to make people uncomfortable. The room felt smaller suddenly. Elena gathered her papers calmly. Truth has that effect. He leaned against the table. Richard made mistakes. But not everything needs to come out. Elena met his eyes. Everything already is. His smile faded. For your own sake, he said quietly. You should let this go. Elena picked up the folder and walked past him. She stopped at the door. You know, she said without turning, when you threaten someone who cleans floors, they stay quiet. She looked back at him now. But when you threaten someone who understands the law, her voice hardened. You confess fear. She walked out, heart racing. Behind her, the man stared at the documents still lying on the table. And for the first time since this began, Elena realized she wasn't just fighting corruption. She was surrounded by it. Elena didn't go home. She drove past her apartment, past the exit she normally took, until the city thinned and the lights grew sparse. She parked beneath a flickering street lamp and sat in silence, the engine ticking as it cooled. The name on that second signature wouldn't leave her mind. Caleb Ward, Board Liaison, Risk Oversight Committee. The man who had smiled at her this morning and said, Glad you're here. We need people like you. People like you. She pulled the folder from her bag and opened it again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. They didn't. Caleb Ward hadn't just approved the altered projections. He'd structured the pathway that hid them. Elena closed her eyes. Going forward meant one thing now. There was no safe version of this anymore. Her phone buzzed. Margaret. I'm making a move, Elena said before Margaret could speak. A pause. Then, carefully. What kind of move? The official one, Elena replied. Whistleblower protections. Federal level. Margaret exhaled sharply. Elena, once you do that, there's no controlling the fallout. I know. They'll come for you, Margaret warned. Legally. Personally. Elena looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked calm, tired, older than she had a week ago. They already are, she said. Another pause. Then Margaret spoke softly. If you do this, I'll back you, publicly. That surprised her. You don't have to, Elena said. I do, Margaret replied. I've been quiet too long. Elena nodded, even though Margaret couldn't see her. Then I'm filing tonight. She drove back toward the city, not to the office, but to a small federal building she remembered from years ago. One with plain walls, harsh lighting, and people who listened more than they spoke. By the time she walked back into the night air, the documents were no longer just files. They were evidence, and her name was officially attached to them. The next morning, the building buzzed louder than ever. Compliance teams swarmed. Outside counsel arrived in black cars. Emails flew faster than anyone could read them. And then, the news broke. Anonymous whistleblower alleges systemic fraud in major acquisition. Anonymous. For now. Elena stood at her desk when she felt it change. The looks. Some are curious. Some are admiring. Some are afraid. And some hostile. Caleb Ward walked toward her. He stopped just short of smiling. You made a mistake, he said quietly. Elena didn't look up from her screen. You made several. You think the law protects you? He whispered. It protects institutions, not individuals. Elena finally met his gaze. Then why are you scared? His jaw tightened. Richard Hallstrom's name flashed across her phone seconds later. She didn't answer. Across the floor, Margaret stepped out of a conference room, her face pale. They know, Margaret said under her breath. Richard and Caleb. They know it was you. Elena closed her laptop slowly. Good, she said. Then we can stop pretending. Margaret hesitated. There's something else. What? They're claiming you accessed documents without authorization, Margaret said. They're building a narrative. Elena felt the familiar chill. Not surprise. Recognition. The same playbook. Different decade. She stood. Then, it's already started, she said. Outside the building, cameras gathered. Inside, allies and enemies took their positions. And Elena Carter understood one final truth. The most dangerous moment isn't when you expose power. It's when power realizes you're willing to stand alone. Elena learned her name was no longer anonymous from a television mounted above the elevator. She stood frozen as the news anchor stared straight into the camera. Sources have now confirmed the whistleblower as Elena Carter, a former corporate attorney currently consulting with the firm. The words landed like a verdict. Around her, the lobby buzzed with sudden movement. Phones lifted. Whispers ignited. Someone gasped softly, not realizing Elena was standing only a few feet away. Margaret stepped out of the elevator behind her and saw the screen. Oh no, she whispered. Elena didn't move. Her name scrolled across the bottom of the screen in bold white letters. No context. No history. No explanation of why she'd been cleaning floors instead of arguing cases. Just a name. And a target. By the time Elena reached the 42nd floor, the damage was done. Emails flooded in, some supportive, some cautious, others openly hostile. Attention-seeking. Disgruntled former employee. Questionable credibility. Richard's narrative was already forming. A junior associate approached her desk, eyes wide. They're saying you were fired years ago for misconduct. Elena felt a slow, familiar burn in her chest. That's a lie, she said calmly. But it's everywhere, he replied. They're calling it retaliation. Margaret arrived moments later, face tight with anger. Richard's team leaked a sealed personnel summary. It's been edited. Elena closed her eyes. Of course it had. They were rewriting her past in real time. Across the floor, Caleb Ward stood with a small group, speaking in low voices. When he noticed Elena watching, he didn't look away. He smiled. Margaret leaned closer. We need to respond. Now. No, Elena said. Margaret blinked. What? They want noise, Elena replied. Emotion. Mistakes. She stood and gathered her things. We give them silence. As Elena walked toward the conference room, phones buzzed again. Breaking news. Company insiders alleged the whistleblower accessed documents without proper clearance. There it was, the counterattack. Inside the conference room, Elena sat alone and opened her laptop. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She prepared. She pulled access logs, timestamps, permission chains, emails authorizing her review signed by 3 board members, including Margaret. Then she found something else. A memo, sent weeks before Richard's removal. A memo recommending Elena Carter be kept away from acquisition documents. Authored by Caleb Ward. Elena's hands still. Margaret entered quietly. They're pushing for your removal from the case. Elena turned the screen toward her. Then we push back with proof. Margaret's eyes widened as she read. This shows intent. Yes, Elena said. They knew I'd see it, and they tried to stop me. Outside the room, raised voices echoed. The company was fracturing under pressure. Margaret straightened. If we release this, it won't just protect you. It'll expose them, Elena finished. Margaret hesitated. Once this goes public, there's no controlling the fallout. Elena thought of the nights she'd scrubbed floors in silence, of the rooms she hadn't been allowed to enter, of the laughter, Good, she said. Margaret nodded. I'll coordinate with counsel. As she turned to leave, Elena's phone buzzed again. Unknown number, she answered. You should have stayed invisible, Richard's voice said softly. Elena smiled for the first time all day. You should have read the document, she replied, and hung up. She looked out at the city, cameras flashing far below. They had taken her name, but they had underestimated one thing. She still had the truth, and now she was ready to let it speak. The documents went live at 9:17 a.m. No press conference, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet upload to 3 regulatory portals and one carefully timed release to the media. Elena watched the progress bar reach 100%. Then she closed her laptop. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the building erupted. Phones rang across the floor. Assistants ran. Executives shouted names down hallways. Compliance officers appeared at doors they'd never entered before. Margaret burst into the conference room, breathless. They've picked it up. Elena nodded. They always do. Screens across the office flickered to life. Breaking. Internal documents reveal coordinated fraud tied to executive leadership. Developing. Evidence suggests intentional concealment of liability clauses. Update, Board Liaison Caleb Ward. Named in whistleblower filings. Caleb's name. Public. Final. Across the floor, Elena saw him freeze mid-step, his phone pressed to his ear. His face drained of color as he stared at the screen. The confident smile he wore so easily was gone. Margaret leaned closer. Regulators are issuing subpoenas. Federal, state, everything. Elena exhaled slowly. Good. Security moved fast now, but not toward her. Toward offices. Toward servers. Toward people who had believed they were untouchable. An executive staggered into a chair, whispering, We're done. We're actually done. No, Elena said quietly, overhearing him. You're exposed. Outside, camera crews gathered like vultures, sensing blood. Inside, the board convened an emergency session. Margaret returned an hour later, eyes blazing. Caleb has resigned. Elena raised an eyebrow. Resigned? Margaret laughed sharply. Tried to. Regulators beat him to it. He's under investigation. Elena felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, not joy, but gravity lifting. And Richard? She asked. Margaret hesitated. He's threatening a lawsuit. Elena smiled faintly. Of course he is. But, Margaret added, his lawyers just withdrew. That did it. Elena laughed once, quietly, almost in disbelief. Around noon, her phone buzzed non-stop. Old colleagues, journalists, former classmates who hadn't returned her messages in years. We always knew you were brilliant. I'm so sorry. Can we talk? Elena ignored them all. Instead, she stepped into the stairwell and sat on the cold concrete steps, finally alone. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from release. Margaret joined her minutes later, sitting beside her without speaking. You okay? Margaret asked softly. Elena nodded. I think so. You just took down 2 powerful men, Margaret said, and possibly the entire acquisition. Elena stared at the wall. They did that themselves. Margaret studied her. Do you know what happens now? Elena thought for a moment. They'll try to settle. Quietly. Yes, Margaret said. And they'll try to discredit you one last time. Elena met her eyes. Let them. Margaret smiled. You've changed this place. Elena shook her head. I exposed it. Outside the stairwell door, applause broke out. Someone clapped. Then another. Wordless. Uncoordinated. People standing at their desks, watching the news, realizing history was happening inside their own building. Elena didn't join them. She stood. Because even now, even after the truth exploded, she knew the hardest part wasn't over yet. Justice had a cost, and she was about to pay for it. The applause faded by evening. That was the first thing Elena noticed. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline, the building was quiet again. Not peaceful, just emptied. Like a battlefield after the noise stops and reality sets in. Elena stood alone in her apartment, shoes still on, keys resting untouched on the counter. The place smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, old habits. Her phone lay face down on the table. She hadn't answered a single message, because the cost had begun to arrive. It came quietly at first. A bank notification, account temporarily restricted under review, an email from her landlord. We received an inquiry regarding your employment status. A voicemail with no voice, just breathing, then silence. Elena sank into the chair. This was the part no one applauded. Margaret had warned her. They'll come for you legally, personally. And they had. Her phone lit up again. Unknown number. She answered. Miss Carter, a smooth voice said. This is Daniel Royce, representing Hallstrom. Elena closed her eyes. I'm not speaking without counsel. Of course, he said pleasantly. I just wanted to make sure you understand the consequences of continuing. I understand them very well, Elena replied. A pause. You're radioactive now, Royce continued. No firm will touch you. No corporation will risk association. Elena felt the old fear rise, but it didn't own her. I've been invisible before, she said. Radioactive is louder, he chuckled. You think this ends with justice? I think it ends with the truth, Elena replied. And that scares people like you. The line went dead. That night, sleep didn't come. Memories did. The day she'd packed up her office years ago. The polite smiles. The silence afterward. The long nights, scrubbing floors while replaying arguments no one had let her finish. She'd survived that. She could survive this too. The next morning, the second wave hit. Her name was everywhere. Panels debated her credibility. Comment sections dissected her past. A former colleague went on air calling her brilliant but difficult. Difficult. The same word. Elena turned off the TV. Margaret arrived an hour later, carrying coffee and exhaustion. They froze your accounts? Margaret asked quietly. Yes. We'll fix that, Margaret said. Legally. Elena looked at her. And socially? Margaret didn't answer. They sat in silence. Finally, Elena spoke. Do you ever regret staying quiet? Margaret swallowed. Every day. Elena nodded. Then this was worth it. Margaret smiled sadly. You shouldn't have to be this strong. Elena stood and walked to the window. The city moved on below. Indifferent. Relentless. I'm not strong, she said. I'm just done being afraid. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from an unknown sender. I know what they're doing to you. I have proof they've done it before. Meet me tonight, alone. Elena stared at the screen. Margaret leaned over. What is it? Elena didn't answer right away, because the cost of truth wasn't finished collecting, and someone from the shadows was offering more, at a price she couldn't yet see. Elena arrived 10 minutes early. The cafe sat on the edge of downtown, half lit, half forgotten. The kind of place people chose when they didn't want to be seen. Neon buzzed faintly in the window. Rain streaked the glass like static. She chose a table near the back, alone. Margaret had argued with her for 20 minutes. Don't go! Bring someone! This could be a trap. But Elena knew something Margaret didn't. When people reached out from the shadows, it was because fear had finally outweighed loyalty. That kind of fear told the truth. The door opened. A man stepped in, shaking rain from his coat. Mid-40s. Ordinary. The kind of face you'd forget seconds after passing him on the street. He scanned the room once. Then his eyes landed on her. He approached slowly. Elena Carter, he asked. Yes. He sat without asking. Placed a slim envelope on the table between them. Didn't touch his coffee. My name doesn't matter, he said quietly. But I used to work in internal audits. 3 companies. Same pattern. Elena didn't reach for the envelope. Why come to me? Because you survived, he replied. Most don't. That caught her attention. He slid the envelope closer. Inside are documents showing how executives identify threats early, people like you. Elena opened it. Her breath caught. Blacklists. Not official. Not centralized. But shared. Quiet emails. Not recommended. High risk. Difficult. Her name appeared more than once. Dated years back. So it wasn't just one firm, she said softly. No, the man replied. It's a system. Elena looked up. Why expose it now? His jaw tightened. Because my daughter starts law school next fall, and I don't want her learning the same lesson you did. Elena closed the envelope. You know what this costs you, she said. I already paid, he replied. I was fired last month. No explanation. They sat in silence, rain drumming against the windows. Elena, he said finally. Richard isn't the worst of them. She met his eyes. I know. There's a settlement coming, he continued. Quiet. Fast. They'll offer you money, protection, a chance to disappear comfortably. Elena smiled faintly. And you think I'll take it? I think, he said carefully. They're counting on it. She stood. So am I, she replied. He frowned. That's dangerous. Yes, she said, but necessary. She slid the envelope into her bag. Thank you. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. One more thing. She paused. They're watching you, he said. Not just legally. Elena nodded. I figured, outside, the rain had stopped. The city breathed. Elena walked to her car slowly, senses sharp, mind racing. The documents in her bag weren't just evidence. They were a map of how power protected itself. Her phone buzzed as she unlocked the door. Margaret. Elena, Margaret said urgently. They've drafted a settlement. It's substantial. Elena slid into the driver's seat. How substantial? She asked. Margaret hesitated. Enough to change your life. Elena stared through the windshield at her reflection. Tell them, she said calmly. I'll read it. She ended the call. The irony didn't escape her. Another document. Another test. Another room waiting to see if she'd stay quiet. Elena started the engine. This time, she was ready to decide who she would be seen as. The document arrived just after midnight. Encrypted. Password protected. Delivered with a polite email that read like an apology and a threat wearing the same smile. Proposed resolution confidential. Elena sat at her kitchen table, the room lit by a single overhead bulb. She didn't open the file right away. Instead, she made tea, let it steep, let herself breathe. She'd learned something over the years. Urgency was a weapon. When they rushed you, it was because they were afraid of what you'd see if you slowed down. She opened the document. The first page was beautiful. Language polished to a mirror shine. Soft words, cooperative words, no admission of wrongdoing, mutual confidentiality, immediate compensation. Her eyes dropped to the number. It was more money than she had ever imagined having at one time. Enough to erase debt, enough to buy silence, enough to disappear. She turned the page. The second page was where the blade hid. A non-disclosure clause so broad it erased the future. Not just what she had revealed, but anything she might reveal. Ever. About anyone involved. Directly or indirectly. They weren't just buying her silence. They were buying her memory. Elena leaned back slowly. Clever. Page 3 tightened the grip further. If she violated the agreement even unintentionally, the penalties were catastrophic. Financial ruin. Legal exposure. Lifetime liability. She smiled faintly. They're terrified, she murmured. Her phone buzzed. Richard. She stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Elena, he said softly, almost warmly. You've made your point. I didn't set out to make one, she replied. You handed it to me. He exhaled. This doesn't have to be a war. It already was, she said. I'm offering you a way out, Richard continued. Dignity, security, peace. Elena flipped to the final page. That's where she found it. Buried beneath the generosity, a clause transferring responsibility, not to the company, to her. If future investigations uncovered misconduct related to the released documents, liability would partially rest on the whistleblower for material influence. Her hands went still. They want to turn me into a problem, she said quietly. Richard didn't deny it. You want to survive, he said. This is how people survive. Elena closed the document. No, she said. This is how people vanish. A pause. You think the world will thank you? Richard asked. You think the truth keeps the lights on? Elena stood and walked to the window. The city stretched endlessly below millions of lives, most of them invisible. "I used to clean your floors," she said. "I survived then, too." Richard's voice hardened. "You're making a mistake." Elena smiled. "I've read the document," she said. Another pause. "And?" he asked. She hung up. Elena reopened the file, not to accept it, but to study it, line by line, clause by clause. Because if they thought this was the end, they hadn't understood the one thing she had proven from the very beginning. She never just read documents. She dissected them. And hidden inside this settlement was their final weakness. Elena didn't sleep. She sat at the table as the night thinned into morning. The settlement document open in front of her, like a body on an autopsy table. Every sentence, every comma, every deliberate ambiguity. They had designed it for speed. Sign quickly, take the money, go quiet. But documents always told the truth to people patient enough to listen. At 4:42 a.m., she found it, a cross-reference buried in the indemnity section. One line pointing to an external appendix, not attached, not linked, just named. Appendix F. Elena frowned and searched the file. Nothing, which meant it wasn't missing. It was separate. She accessed the company's secure archive using credentials Margaret had authorized weeks earlier, credentials Richard's team had clearly forgotten to revoke in their rush. Appendix F loaded. And Elena exhaled slowly. There it was. A contingency memo outlining what to do if the whistleblower refused settlement. Not speculation, not theory, a plan. It detailed a coordinated narrative. Discredit her publicly, question her mental stability, challenge her access rights, and if necessary shift legal exposure onto her using the very settlement she was meant to sign. The clause she'd noticed wasn't an accident. It was the knife. And suddenly, everything became clear. They hadn't offered her peace. They'd offered her a confession. Elena printed the appendix. Then she printed the metadata. Then the internal approval chain. By the time the sun rose, she had built a map so clean it was devastating. Her phone buzzed at 7:12 a.m. "Margaret." "Elena," she said, already tense. "They're asking if you've reviewed the settlement." "I have," Elena replied calmly. "And?" Elena smiled. "I think they made a mistake." Margaret paused. "What kind?" "The kind people make when they assume desperation," Elena said. "I need you to schedule a board session. Emergency. Full attendance." Margaret inhaled. "That's bold." "They'll come," Elena said, "because they'll think I'm ready to fold." She packed the documents carefully into her bag. By the time Elena entered the building, the mood had shifted again. Whispers followed her. Eyes tracked her movements. But now there was something else, too. Expectation. The boardroom filled slowly. Seats taken. Laptops opened. Legal counsel on standby. Richard wasn't there. Yet, Margaret nodded at Elena from the head of the table. "You asked for time." Elena stood. "Thank you," she said. "This will be brief." She connected her laptop to the screen. The settlement document appeared first. "I was offered this last night," Elena said evenly. "As a resolution." Murmurs rippled. Then she clicked. Appendix F filled the screen. Silence fell like a dropped glass. "This," Elena continued, "is the plan attached to that settlement." Faces tightened. A board member leaned forward. "Where did this come from?" "The same place the settlement came from," Elena replied. "Your internal archives." Margaret's voice was quiet. "Is it authentic?" Elena clicked again. Metadata. Timestamps. Digital signatures. Richard's name. Caleb's. And two others are still sitting at the table. Gasps. One of them stood abruptly. "This is out of context." "No," Elena said. "This is the intent." At that moment, the doors opened. Richard walked in. Late. Confidence. Smiling. Until he saw the screen. Until he realized he hadn't been negotiating. He'd been documented. Elena met his eyes across the room. "You offered me a trap," she said calmly. "So I brought you the proof." The room wasn't his anymore, and he knew it. Richard Hallstrom didn't sit down. He stood at the doorway, one hand resting on the back of an empty chair, eyes locked on the screen like it might change if he stared long enough. It didn't. Appendix F remained frozen there. Cold, precise, undeniable. "This is fabricated," Richard said finally, his voice sharp but thin. "You don't know what you're looking at." Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. Margaret spoke instead. "The metadata confirms it was drafted internally, reviewed by legal, and approved." Richard laughed once, too loudly. "Approved by who?" Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "By you." The room shifted. Not metaphorically, physically. People adjusted in their seats. Laptops closed. Pens stopped moving. The air thickened with the realization that this wasn't a discussion anymore, it was an unraveling. Richard took a step forward. "This is a witch hunt," Elena spoke then, calm as ever. "No, this is documentation." She clicked again. A timeline appeared. Emails, edits, approvals, each one tightening the noose. "This appendix outlines a coordinated plan," Elena said, "to neutralize a whistleblower by offering a settlement designed to transfer liability onto them if they refused silence." She paused. "I was never meant to sign it." A board member stood. "Then why offer it?" Elena answered before Richard could. "Because they assumed I needed the money more than I needed the truth." Richard's face reddened. "You're enjoying this." Elena met his eyes. "I'm ending it." Margaret turned to the board. "We are now exposed to criminal liability if we ignore this." Another board member nodded. "Agreed." Richard looked around, suddenly aware that no one was looking back at him for permission. "You can't do this," he said quietly now. "I built this company." Margaret stood. "You endangered it." Richard's voice cracked. "Because I wanted to win." Elena tilted her head slightly. "You wanted to never lose." Silence. The difference mattered. Margaret spoke carefully, formally. "Effective immediately, I motion for the suspension of Richard Hallstrom pending investigation." "I second," someone said instantly. Another voice followed. "So do I." Richard stared at them. Disbelief, giving way to something closer to fear. "This is insane," he whispered. Elena watched him not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity. "This," she said softly, "is what happens when documents stop being weapons and start being witnesses." Security appeared at the doorway, not aggressively, respectfully. "Mr. Hallstrom," one said, "we need you to come with us." Richard didn't move. He looked at Elena one last time. "You think this makes you powerful?" Elena considered the question. "No," she said. "It makes me free." Richard's shoulders sagged as reality finally landed. He walked out without another word. The door closed behind him, and just like that, the man who had laughed at a cleaning lady over a $3 million document was gone. No applause followed, just quiet, the kind that comes when something irreversible has happened. Margaret exhaled slowly. "It's done." Elena shook her head. "Not yet." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" Elena glanced at the screen still glowing at the front of the room. "This was private reckoning," she said. "The public one hasn't happened." Outside the boardroom, reporters waited. Cameras ready. Questions loaded. And Elena knew if she walked out there, everything would change forever. Again. The doors opened. Light flooded in first. Then sound. Cameras clicked. Microphones surged forward. Reporters spoke over one another, voices sharp with urgency, hunger, anticipation. "Elena, over here. Is it true the CEO has been removed? Were you retaliated against? Are the allegations criminal?" Elena stepped forward slowly, not rushed, not hidden, seen. Margaret stood a step behind her, but this moment belonged to Elena alone. She raised one hand. The noise faded, not because they were told to stop, because something about her stillness demanded it. "My name is Elena Carter," she said calmly, "and I was asked to stay silent." A ripple moved through the crowd. "I was offered money, protection, a clean exit," she continued, "in exchange for forgetting what I read." She paused. "But don't forget," she said, "and neither do the people hurt by them." Cameras leaned in. A reporter shouted, "Were you targeted because of your position in the company?" Elena nodded once. "Because of my position outside it." Another voice, "You were a cleaner. How did you even access these files?" Elena didn't flinch. "I was invited to read a document worth $3 million, she said. "I did exactly that," the crowd murmured. "And when I read it," she continued, "I saw what others hoped no one ever would." She gestured back toward the building. "Fraud doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks like confidence, like jokes, like power, assuming it won't be questioned." A reporter asked, "Are there others involved?" Elena held their gaze. Yes. That single word landed harder than any accusation. "Names?" Someone pressed. "They're in the filings," Elena said. "Where they belong." Silence followed. Then applause. Not loud, not wild, but real. A journalist near the front lowered her mic. "Do you regret not taking the settlement?" Elena thought for a moment. "No," she said, "because the cost of silence is always higher than the cost of truth." Margaret stepped forward then. "All documents have been submitted to regulators. We will cooperate fully." Elena took one step back. Her part was done. As she turned to leave, a voice called out, "What happens to you now?" Elena paused. She looked at the cameras one last time. "I'm going home," she said, "and for the first time in years, I don't carry anyone else's lies with me." She walked away as flashes erupted again. Inside the building, chaos spread. Outside, headlines formed. And across the city, across screens and conversations, one story cut through the noise. A woman they laughed at had read a document, and power had fallen apart because of it. But Elena knew one chapter remained. Not about them, about her. The fallout didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves. First came the resignations. One executive after another stepped down pending investigation. Names that once carried weight now appeared in headlines, followed by the same careful phrase, "under review." Offices were emptied overnight. Access badges deactivated. Power dismantled quietly, the way it had once protected itself. Then came the deals. The acquisition was suspended. Partners withdrew. Investors demanded answers that couldn't be smoothed over with rehearsed confidence. The stock dipped, then fell harder. Analysts called it an overreaction. Regulators disagreed. Federal investigators moved in with a precision Elena recognized. Subpoenas. Seized servers. Interviews conducted behind closed doors, where no jokes softened the tone. And the clause. The $3 million clause. It became infamous. Law schools dissected it. Journals published case studies. Compliance teams rewrote entire playbooks because of it. The cleaning lady clause, they called it. A warning disguised as a joke. The company survived barely, but it emerged smaller, watched and changed. Not redeemed, just altered. Across the industry, something shifted. Whistleblower policies were rewritten. Settlement agreements scrutinized. Quiet blacklists never acknowledged, always denied, were suddenly discussed in the open. Not eliminated, but named. And naming things mattered. Elena watched all of this from a distance. She didn't give interviews after that first day, didn't join panels, didn't capitalize on the moment the way people expected her to. She stayed home. For a while, she slept. Long, deep sleep that felt like catching up on years of exhaustion. Her accounts were unfrozen. Legal protections kicked in. Support arrived from unexpected places, former students she'd mentored briefly, junior lawyers who said her story gave them courage, people she'd never met who simply wrote, "Thank you for not staying quiet." There were still consequences. Some doors stayed closed. Some always would. But others opened. Slowly. Carefully. Margaret visited one evening with takeout and a tired smile. "You've changed more than you know," she said. Elena shook her head. "I just read what was in front of me." Margaret studied her. "Most people don't. They ate in silence." Later that night, Elena walked past an office building downtown. Cleaning crews moved inside, quiet, efficient, invisible. She stopped, watched. For the first time, She didn't feel pulled back there by loss, only memory. She thought of the woman she'd been when she pushed that card into the boardroom. The woman people laughed at. The woman who had every reason to stay quiet. She thought of the document. How it had been meant to humiliate her. How it had failed. Elena smiled softly. Power hadn't fallen because she shouted. It had fallen because she read and understood. As she turned away, her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. We're starting something new. Independent. Transparent. We want you involved. Not as a symbol, as a safeguard. Elena stared at the screen. The city lights reflected in her window like possibilities she'd once stopped believing in. She didn't respond right away. Some decisions deserved time, because the story that began with mockery and silence wasn't ending in noise or applause. It was ending in choice. Elena returned to the building one last time. Not to the 42nd floor. Not to the boardroom with the glass walls and polished table where laughter once cut sharper than words. She came early, before the city woke, when hallways still echoed and lights hummed softly above empty desks. The security guard at the entrance nodded at her. Not politely, respectfully. She walked past the elevators and took the stairs. Down. She reached the storage room where cleaning carts were kept. Identical rows, buckets lined up, mops hanging neatly like tools waiting for hands that knew them well. Elena stood there for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out something folded. Her old uniform, clean, pressed, still faintly smelling of lemon and disinfectant. She held it carefully, remembering the nights she'd worn it like armor. The way it made her invisible. The way invisibility had taught her how to observe. She placed it gently on the shelf. Not discarded. Retired. Elena stepped back into the hallway as sunlight crept through the windows. Later that morning, she sat in a small office across town, nothing grand. No glass walls, no intimidating table. Just clean lines, open bookshelves, and people who listened before they spoke. The new firm didn't have a name yet. They called it the Safeguard for now. Independent oversight. Transparent review. The kind of work that existed not to win deals, but to stop damage before it happened. Elena took the seat at the head of the table not because she demanded it, but because no one questioned it. A young woman across from her shifted nervously. "I've never seen someone do what you did," she said. Elena smiled gently. "You don't have to do it the same way." The woman nodded. "But you showed it could be done." The team around the table was small, but purposeful. A former compliance officer who'd been pushed out for asking too many questions. A data analyst who'd discovered irregularities and been told to ignore them. A paralegal who'd watched documents disappear and couldn't stay silent anymore. Each of them carried scars. Each of them had chosen truth over comfort. "We're not here to destroy companies," Elena said, addressing the room. "We're here to protect them from themselves." She paused, letting the words settle. The best defense against fraud isn't secrecy. It's transparent. The best protection against corruption isn't silence. It's documentation. One man, gray-haired, wearing a worn suit, spoke up. "But who's going to hire us? After what happened, won't companies see us as threats?" Elena met his eyes. "The good ones won't. The ones worth protecting will understand that what we offer isn't exposure, it's prevention." Margaret had helped set this up. Quietly, carefully, using connections built over decades. She'd called it institutional immunity through institutional honesty. Elena called it something simpler, accountability that didn't wait for catastrophe. The young woman who'd spoken earlier raised her hand hesitantly. "What if we find something terrible? What if the client doesn't want us to report it?" Elena didn't hesitate. "Then we report it anyway. That's the agreement. That's always the agreement. Transparency isn't selective." Later, as Elena reviewed their first potential client, a mid-sized tech company concerned about their acquisition practices, she found herself smiling. Not because the work was easy, but because it was honest. There were no hidden clauses here. No traps disguised as opportunities. Just clear terms, clear expectations, clear consequences. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. They're teaching your case in law school. Elena stopped, staring at the screen. She closed her eyes, not from pride, but from something quieter. Relief. She looked up at the sky through the office window, the city moving around her, indifferent and alive. That evening, Elena received an email that made her pause. The subject line read, "Invitation to speak, Harvard Law School." She opened it slowly. They wanted her to lecture on corporate ethics, on whistleblower protections, on the hidden language of contracts that protected power instead of people. She thought about declining. Part of her wanted to stay in the background, to do the work without the attention. But then she remembered the young woman at the table that morning, the nervousness, the hope, the need for someone to show that speaking up didn't have to mean destruction. Elena clicked reply and began typing. "I would be honored." 3 months later, Elena stood in front of 200 law students. The lecture hall was packed, standing room only. She wore the same simple dark suit she'd worn when she returned to the 42nd floor. No flash, no pretense, just presence. "My name is Elena Carter," she began, "and I used to clean the floors in buildings like this." A murmur rippled through the room. "Before that, I sat in seats like yours. And after that, I learned something that no classroom ever taught me." She clicked to the first slide. A document. Dense. Complex. Familiar. "This," she said, "is what power looks like when it thinks no one is watching." She let them study it for a moment. "Can anyone tell me what's wrong with it?" Hands shot up. Eager. Confidence. She called on a young man in the front row. "The indemnity clause transfers personal liability," he said. Elena nodded. "Correct. What else?" Another student. "The cross-references are deliberately obscure." "Yes," Elena said. "What else?" The room went quiet. Elena waited. Finally, a woman in the back raised her hand slowly. "It assumes no one will read it carefully enough to notice." Elena smiled. "Exactly." She advanced the slide. "This document was designed not just to protect the company, but to protect certain people within the company at the expense of others. And it worked, until someone actually read it. She told them the story, not for sympathy, not for applause, but for education. She showed them the clause, the reversal, the trap hidden in the settlement, the appendix that revealed intent. Documents, Elena said, are never just words on paper. They're weapons, they're shields, they're confessions, and they're evidence. She clicked a new slide. The question isn't whether you'll encounter documents like this. You will. The question is, what will you do when you find them? The room was silent. Will you flag them? Will you challenge them? Or will you tell yourself it's not your problem? That someone else will notice? That you're too junior to speak up? Elena stepped away from the podium. I'm not here to tell you that speaking up is easy. It's not. I lost my career the first time I tried. I lost my savings, my reputation, my access. She paused. But I didn't lose my skills, and I didn't lose my integrity. And eventually, those were the only things that mattered. After the lecture, students crowded around. Questions flew. Some wanted advice. Some wanted reassurance. Some just wanted to say they'd heard her speak. One young woman waited until the crowd thinned. Miss Carter, she said quietly, I'm clerking at a firm this summer. What if I see something wrong? Elena looked at her, really looked at her. She saw herself at that age. Brilliant, hopeful, scared. Document everything. Elena said, keep copies, timestamps, emails, not because you want to be a whistleblower, but because if you ever need to be one, you'll have what you need. The woman nodded, eyes bright with something between fear and determination. Did you ever regret it? She asked. Elena considered the question. I regretted the cost, she said honestly, but I never regretted the choice. That night, Elena sat in her apartment, the same one she'd nearly lost when her accounts were frozen, the same one that had felt like a prison when she'd had nowhere else to go. But now it feels different. Not bigger, not fancier, just hers. Her phone buzzed. Margaret, did you see the news? Elena opened her laptop. The headline appeared immediately. Former CEO Richard Hallstrom, sentenced to 8 years for fraud. Below it, another headline. Board liaison Caleb Ward reaches plea agreement, cooperating with investigators. Elena read the articles carefully. The sentences were substantial. The fallout is complete. Richard's empire, built on confidence and control, had collapsed entirely. And the document that started it all, the $3 million document he'd handed her as a joke, had become Exhibit A in a federal prosecution. She closed the laptop. There was no satisfaction in it, no joy, just closure. The kind that comes when something that should happen finally does. Her phone buzzed again. This time, an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Miss Carter? A young voice. Male. Nervous. Yes? My name is David Chen. I'm a junior analyst at a financial firm. And I think I found something. Something is wrong. In a document. Elena sat up straighter. Tell me about it. He explained haltingly at first. Then faster. Revenue projections that didn't match internal reports. Approvals that came from people who shouldn't have had access. Cross-references that led nowhere. It sounds like a Section 14 situation, Elena said. David exhaled shakily. That's what I thought. That's why I called. I read about your case. I know what happened to you. I'm scared of what will happen if I report this. Elena stood and walked to the window. The city glittered below. Millions of lives. Most of them are invisible. I can't promise it will be easy, she said, but I can promise you won't be alone. She gave him the number for the safeguard. Call them tomorrow. Ask for me. We'll walk you through it. Safely. Properly. Thank you, David whispered. Elena smiled. Thank you for calling. She hung up and stared at the phone. This was it. This was what came after. Not fame. Not wealth. Not recognition. Just the quiet work of helping others see what power didn't want them to see. The next morning, Elena woke early. She made coffee, read the news, and then she did something she hadn't done in years. She opened her closet and looked at the space where her cleaning uniform used to hang. It wasn't there anymore. It was on a shelf in a storage room in a building downtown, retired, but not forgotten. She thought about the woman who had worn that uniform, the woman who had learned to be invisible, the woman who had survived by staying small. That woman was still part of her, would always be part of her. But she wasn't defined by her anymore. Elena dressed in her simple dark suit. No designer labels, no flash. Just clean lines and quiet confidence. She grabbed her bag and walked out into the morning light. The city was waking up. Traffic hummed. People rushed past, buried in their phones, their thoughts, their lives. At the office, her team was already working. Files spread across tables, screens glowing with data. The young woman from her first day looked up. David Chen called. He's coming in this afternoon. Elena nodded. Good. Let's be ready. They spent the morning preparing, building frameworks, establishing protocols, creating the kind of structure that protected whistleblowers before they needed protection. This was the work. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just methodical, careful, honest. When David arrived, he looked exactly like Elena expected. Young, scared, carrying a folder he gripped too tightly. She greeted him at the door. Thank you for coming. He nodded, unable to speak. She guided him to a conference room smaller than the one on the 42nd floor, but cleaner, more honest. Tell us what you found, Elena said. David opened his folder with trembling hands. As he began to explain, Elena listened carefully, not just to his words, but to the fear beneath them. The hope, the desperate need to do the right thing even when the right thing felt impossible. When he finished, Elena looked at her team. They nodded. They'd heard enough. David, Elena said gently, what you found is real, and it's serious. But you did the right thing by coming here first. What happens now? He asked. Now, Elena said. We document everything. We build your case so carefully that when you're ready to report it, no one can dismiss you. No one can silence you. And no one can rewrite your story. David's eyes filled with tears. I thought I was alone. Elena shook her head. You were never alone. You just didn't know where to look. She slid a document across the table. This is our agreement. Read it. Every word, every clause. Make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. David picked it up. I started reading. Elena watched him. She saw herself in his concentration, his fear, his determination. After several minutes, he looked up. This protects me. Yes, Elena said. That's the point. He signed it. And in that moment, Elena understood something profound. The story that began with her being laughed at in a boardroom wasn't just her story anymore. It was becoming a blueprint, a pathway, a promise that speaking up didn't have to mean destruction. Months passed. David's case went public. The company he'd worked for launched an internal investigation. Regulators followed. And like dominoes, the truth emerged. Not explosively, not dramatically, just inevitably. Because that's what truth does when it's documented carefully enough. Elena's firm grew. Slowly, carefully. They turned down more clients than they accepted. Because this wasn't about profit, it was about principle. They only worked with people and companies genuinely committed to transparency, to be honest, to change the systems that had protected corruption for so long. One evening, as Elena locked up the office, her phone rang. Margaret, turn on the news. Elena pulled out her phone and found the live stream. A news anchor was speaking. And in a landmark decision, the SEC has announced new regulations requiring independent oversight of corporate acquisitions. The regulations, informally known as the Carter Protocol's mandate. Elena stopped listening. She sat down on the office steps, not because she was tired, but because she needed to feel grounded. Her name was attached to regulations, to change, to systems. Margaret's voice came through the phone. You did it, Elena. You actually did it. Elena shook her head, even though Margaret couldn't see her. We did it. All of us who refused to stay quiet. Margaret laughed softly. Always so humble. Not humble, Elena said. Honest. There's a difference. Later that night, Elena stood once more at her apartment window. The city glittered below, endless, indifferent, alive. Somewhere in those buildings, someone was reading a document, noticing something wrong, deciding whether to speak up or stay silent. She hoped they would speak. She hoped they would remember that documents could be weapons or witnesses, depending on who was brave enough to read them carefully. Her phone buzzed one last time. Another unknown number. Another message. I think I found something. Can we talk? Elena smiled. She typed back, yes. Call this number tomorrow. You're not alone. Because that was the truth she'd learned. The truth she carried forward. The truth that had transformed her from invisible to undeniable. Power didn't fall because someone shouted at it. Power fell because someone read it, understood it, documented it, and refused to let it hide. The story that began with mockery in a boardroom didn't end with revenge or applause. It ended with something quieter, something stronger, something that would outlast headlines and settlements, and even Elena herself. It ended with a choice. The choice to see, the choice to speak, the choice to believe that truth, when documented carefully enough, was more powerful than any amount of money or influence or fear. Elena turned away from the window. Tomorrow, there will be more work, more documents, more people who needed help seeing what power hoped they wouldn't see. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She had been invisible once, powerless, erased, and she had survived it. Not by becoming loud, not by seeking revenge, but by doing what she'd always done best. Reading, understanding, refusing to let important words disappear into silence. The document that was meant to humiliate her had done the opposite. It had revealed who she'd always been and who she was becoming. A safeguard, a witness, a reminder that brilliance doesn't disappear just because someone tries to make it invisible. It just waits, quietly, patiently, for the right moment, the right document, the right question. And when that moment comes, it changes everything. If this story moved you, don't scroll away. Subscribe now. And comment, "I subscribe." I personally welcome every new member. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Elena? Would you have taken the settlement? Or would you have fought for the truth? Let me know below.